The boy did not know the name of the ocean that was trying to kill him. He only knew the sound of it, the endless roaring darkness, the creaking wood, the cries of men who prayed loudly at night and screamed quietly by morning. He clutched the iron ring bolted into the side of the ship as salt water soaked his thin wool shirt, and he wondered dimly if God lived inside the waves or somewhere beyond them. His name was Elias Hale, and if he survived this crossing, his blood would remain on American soil for more than 300 years. The year was 1637. The ship Providence staggered westward through the Atlantic like a wounded animal. It had left England with hope, sermons, and fear packed tightly into its hull. Most of the passengers were Puritans, men and women fleeing a homeland that no longer felt holy enough, no longer safe enough for the kind of God they believed in. Elias was 12 years old. His father, Thomas Hale, stood above him on the deck, one hand gripping the rail, the other clutching a leather-bound Bible so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Thomas Hale was not a loud man. He had been a cooper in Essex, shaping barrels for merchants who drank too much and paid too little. But he had listened closely in church. He had listened when the preacher spoke of a new world, a place where God's law could be built from the ground up, without kings, without bishops, without compromise. Thomas believed that obedience would save his family. The ocean did not care. For weeks the ship had been battered by storms. Sickness spread quickly in the cramped quarters below deck. Children coughed until they bled. One woman had been buried at sea, her body wrapped in canvas and dropped into the gray nothingness, while her husband stared without crying. Elias had learned that fear could become normal. On the 46th day, land was sighted. The cry rippled through the ship like electricity. Men rushed to the rail. Women fell to their knees. Thomas Hale whispered a prayer of thanks, so quiet that only Elias heard it. What Elias saw did not look like salvation. It was cold shoreline, dark forests, a land that seemed to watch them back. They disembarked near the Massachusetts Bay Colony, joining a fragile settlement already struggling to survive. Wooden houses crouched against the wind. Smoke drifted from chimneys. The ground was hard, the air sharp. This was not the paradise they had imagined. This was work. This was hunger. This was survival. Thomas Hale built their first home with his own hands. Elias carried stones until his back ached and his fingers cracked. His mother, Margaret, learned to cook with unfamiliar grains, unfamiliar animals, unfamiliar rules. They learned quickly that this land belonged to others. The native tribes watched them from the edge of the trees. At first there was trade, then suspicion, then fear, then violence. The Pequot War came swiftly and brutally. Elias was 15 years old when he first smelled burned villages. He watched men he knew speak of God while holding muskets. He watched fire consume homes that looked too much like his own. That was the first lesson America taught the Hale family. Faith and violence could live in the same house. By the time Thomas Hale died of fever in 1651, Elias was a man. He inherited land, a name, and a belief drilled into him since childhood that survival meant obedience, and obedience meant righteousness. He married Rebecca Moore, the daughter of another settler, and together they raised 4 children. They farmed, they prayed, they expanded westward acre by acre, tree by tree. Their eldest son, Samuel Hale, was born into a colony that was no longer merely surviving. It was growing, expanding, taking. Samuel grew up hearing stories of England as a place of chains. He never saw those chains. He only saw the vastness of America and believed deeply that it had been given to him. By the early 1700s, the Hale family had moved inland, following rivers, carving farms out of forest. They lived under British rule, paid British taxes, fought in British wars. Samuel Hale fought as a young man in King George's War, marching alongside other colonists to defend land that was not truly theirs. He returned hardened, less faithful than his father, more practical. When Samuel's son, Jonathan Hale, was born in 1725, the world was already changing. Jonathan grew up hearing whispers of unfair laws, distant kings, taxes levied by men who had never stepped foot on American soil. He apprenticed as a printer in Boston, where ideas flowed faster than blood. Pamphlets, arguments, names like Locke and Montesquieu passed from hand to hand like contraband. Jonathan learned that words could be weapons. In 1770, he stood in the crowd during the Boston Massacre. He did not throw the first stone, he did not fire the first shot, but he saw men die in the snow, and something inside him broke cleanly in half. By the time war came, Jonathan was ready. He joined the Continental Army not out of romance, but anger. He marched barefoot through winter. He watched friends starve. He heard George Washington speak and believed, briefly, that history was listening. Jonathan survived Valley Forge. He survived disease, hunger, and the sound of cannon fire tearing men apart. When the war ended, he returned home with scars, a small pension, and a belief that America had been born in pain and would never escape it. He named his first son Liberty Hale. It was a ridiculous name, a hopeful one, a dangerous one. Liberty Hale grew up in a nation that promised equality and delivered contradiction. He learned to read the Constitution. He learned to ignore the chains on enslaved men working nearby farms. He learned that freedom had borders, and those borders were drawn by power. By 1800, the Hale family owned land. They owned livestock. They did not own slaves, but they benefited from a system built on them. Liberty Hale knew this, though he rarely said it aloud. His son, Ezekiel Hale, said it aloud. Ezekiel was born restless. He watched wagons move west and felt pulled by something older than reason. He joined the push beyond the Appalachians, settling in Kentucky, then Tennessee. He hunted on land taken from tribes, pushed further and further away by treaties that meant nothing. When Andrew Jackson rose to power, Ezekiel cheered. When native tribes were forced along the Trail of Tears, Ezekiel did not cheer, but he did not stop it either. That was another lesson the Hales learned. Silence could be as powerful as cruelty. By the time Ezekiel's children were grown, the nation was splitting. North and South stared at each other across moral and economic fault lines, soaked in blood waiting to happen. The Hale family stood divided. One son moved north to Ohio, another stayed south in Tennessee. Both claimed righteousness. When the Civil War came, it did not ask for permission. Brothers fought on opposite sides. Letters stopped arriving. Graves filled. Matthew Hale, fighting for the Union, watched Gettysburg turn into hell. Caleb Hale, fighting for the Confederacy, lost a leg outside Atlanta. Both survived. Neither truly lived afterward. The war ended slavery and broke something deeper. By 1865, the Hale family had been farmers, soldiers, settlers, rebels, patriots, and bystanders. They had crossed an ocean, a continent, and their own consciences, and the century was not done with them yet. Because the blood that crossed the ocean was still moving forward, towards factories, towards cities, towards wars that would reach across the world, towards a future that would demand new sacrifices and new sins.
The train did not slow down for farms. It tore through the Ohio countryside like a declaration of intent, leaving behind thunder, smoke, and a future that no longer cared about soil or seasons. Jonathan Hale II, great-grandson of the patriot who had frozen at Valley Forge, stood on the platform at Cincinnati and felt something ancient loosen inside his chest. This was not land, this was motion. The year was 1881, and America was shedding its skin. Jonathan was 22, lean, sharp-eyed, carrying a single leather bag and the weight of a family that had begun to fracture under its own history. His father, Matthew Hale, had returned from the Civil War alive but hollow. The farm never recovered, neither did Matthew. He drank quietly, spoke rarely, and died in his sleep before Jonathan turned 19. The farm was sold. Steel bought the future now. Jonathan followed the rail lines north into Pittsburgh, where the air burned the throat and the sky glowed orange at night. Mills rose like fortresses, rivers ran thick and black. Men moved in herds, pouring into furnaces and spilling back out at dawn, coughing, sweating, aging 10 years at a time. Jonathan became one of them. He worked 12-hour shifts feeding iron into machines that did not pause, did not forgive, and did not remember the names of the men they crushed. He learned quickly that America no longer needed belief or bravery, it needed endurance. He sent money home to his mother. He slept in boarding houses packed with immigrants, Irish, Italian, Polish, men who spoke different languages but shared the same exhaustion. They drank together, fought together, buried each other. Jonathan married Anna Kowalski, the daughter of a Polish steelworker killed when a crane cable snapped. She was small, fierce, and unafraid of the world. Together they had 3 children in a city that never slept and never softened. Their eldest son, Thomas Hale, was 10 when he began working. Child labor was not a crime, it was an expectation. Thomas crawled beneath machines to retrieve scraps. His fingers learned the language of cuts and burns. He grew up fast, shoulders hunched, eyes old. School was a rumor, hunger was real. Anna told stories at night about farms, about rivers that ran clear, about a country that once promised more than this. Thomas listened, but the mills drowned out dreams. In 1907, the panic came. Banks collapsed, wages vanished, men jumped from bridges. Jonathan Hale watched a foreman hang himself inside a warehouse and understood fully that the nation he lived in could devour its builders without remorse. When strikes erupted, Jonathan joined them. He marched beside thousands, demanding safer conditions, shorter hours, the right to be seen as human. Pinkertons came with clubs and guns. The National Guard followed. Blood stained the streets. Thomas watched his father beaten and arrested. Something hardened permanently inside him. When World War I arrived, Thomas lied about his age and enlisted. He crossed the Atlantic not as a pilgrim, but as a soldier. France was mud and death and noise. Trenches swallowed men whole. Gas burned lungs from the inside out. Thomas carried wounded boys who screamed for mothers that could not reach them. He survived. Millions did not. When Thomas returned in 1919, America greeted him with parades and indifference. Jobs were scarce. Trauma was private. Anna died of influenza during the Great Pandemic, buried without ceremony. Jonathan Hale lived just long enough to see his son come home changed. Then he, too, was gone. Thomas married Eleanor Brooks, a schoolteacher who believed knowledge could repair anything. She was wrong, but she tried anyway. They moved to Detroit, where the future was being assembled one car at a time. The assembly line was efficient, brutal, revolutionary. Thomas became a foreman at a Ford plant. He enforced rules he hated because feeding his family required obedience. His children grew up between optimism and anxiety. Their youngest, Robert Hale, was born in 1925, just as America convinced itself it could never fall.
The crash came anyway. The Great Depression hollowed out the country. Men lined up for bread. Pride collapsed faster than banks. Thomas lost his job, then his house, then Eleanor. She died quietly, exhausted by scarcity. Robert watched his father shrink, not physically, but spiritually. By the time Franklin Roosevelt spoke of a New Deal, Robert believed words might still matter. When World War II came, Robert did not hesitate. He flew bombers over Europe, watching cities turn to fire beneath him. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself it was righteous. He told himself nothing when the war ended and the silence returned. Robert came home to a nation transformed. Factories boomed, suburbs spread, television glowed. America crowned itself leader of the free world. Robert married Margaret Lewis. They bought a house with a lawn and a flag. They had 2 children. The past was buried beneath mortgages and optimism. But history does not stay buried. Their son James Hale grew up during the Cold War, practicing nuclear drills in school, hiding beneath desks from bombs that could erase cities. He watched his father stare at nothing on Sunday mornings. James believed something was wrong with the story America told itself. When Vietnam arrived, James went. He marched through jungles that did not want him there, fighting an enemy that refused to be visible. He learned that power could be confused, that orders could be lies, that survival did not equal victory. He came home angry. He protested, he argued, he fractured from his parents, from neighbors, from the myth of American innocence. By the time James had his own son, Michael Hale, the country was tired. Factories closed, drugs spread, trust eroded. Michael grew up amid Reagan's speeches and empty promises, watching wealth concentrate while opportunity thinned. He joined the military after 9/11, believing, briefly, that clarity had returned. It had not. Wars blurred together, reasons shifted, friends died. When Michael came home, he carried silence like an inheritance. And still, the Hale bloodline moved forward, into a century shaped by screens, surveillance, fear, and extraordinary power. The ocean that Elias Hale had crossed had not ended at the shore. It had simply changed forms.
On the morning of September 11th, 2001, the sky over Virginia was a clean, impossible blue. Michael Hale noticed it because it felt wrong, too calm, too open. He had learned in deserts half a world away that danger often arrived on beautiful days. He was 31 years old, recently discharged from the army, trying to learn how to live without orders. He was standing in his kitchen when the phone rang. By the time he turned on the television, the first tower was already burning. Michael did not speak for a long time. He watched the second plane hit live, watched fire bloom from steel, watched people run through streets coated in ash. Somewhere deep inside him, a switch flipped that had never truly turned off since Vietnam had done the same thing to his father. America had found its next war. Within weeks, Michael re-enlisted, not out of patriotism, but inevitability. The Hale men had always gone when history demanded bodies. He told his wife, Laura, that it would be different, shorter, cleaner, necessary. Laura did not believe him, but she kissed him goodbye anyway. Afghanistan was a war without edges. Mountains swallowed sound. Enemies dissolved into civilians and reappeared as ghosts. Michael learned that technology could see everything except intention. Drones hovered like mechanical gods. Intelligence shifted daily. Certainty never arrived. He did 3 tours. By the time Iraq began, the reason no longer mattered. Orders flowed downward. Doubt flowed upward. Michael led men younger than his son would someday be. He wrote letters to families when things went wrong. He came home in 2008 to a country collapsing under its own excess. Banks failed. Houses vanished, retirement accounts dissolved. Michael watched men in suits receive bailouts while soldiers he knew slept in cars. The factory closures his grandfather had warned about were complete now. Steel towns had become ghost towns. Michael tried to work security, then logistics, then nothing. The war did not leave him when he left it. His son, Ethan Hale, grew up watching his father stare at screens late at night, scrolling news, absorbing disasters like a habit. Ethan was born in 2003 into a world of alerts and warnings and background fear. He learned to swipe before he learned to write. History reached him through pixels, videos of distant wars, economic charts, arguments compressed into headlines. He did not experience America as a promise or a betrayal. He experienced it as noise. At school, they practiced lockdown drills instead of nuclear drills. The desks no longer felt like protection. They felt like theater. Michael tried to talk to Ethan about the past, about oceans crossed, wars survived, factories built, lines marched, but the words landed softly, then disappeared. The past competed with everything else and lost. Laura watched the distance grow. In 2016, the country cracked open. Politics became personal. Neighbors stopped speaking. Families argued across dinner tables. Truth splintered into versions that refused to recognize one another. Michael felt the fracture in his bones. He had fought for a country that could no longer agree on what it was. Ethan watched it all unfold online, where anger traveled faster than thought, and identity became armor. He learned to perform certainty even when he felt none. College was expensive, debt was assumed, stability felt theoretical. Then came 2020. A virus shut the world down. Streets emptied, hospitals overflowed, death became statistical. Michael watched the same fear he had seen in war return to grocery stores and living rooms. Ethan attended classes through a screen, graduated into an economy that did not want him. He marched in protests where chants echoed the same demands his ancestors had made centuries earlier: fairness, dignity, recognition. Michael watched from the sidelines, unsure whether to be proud or afraid. One night, Ethan asked about their family, not casually, seriously. Michael dug through boxes he had not opened in years. Letters, photographs, a Bible older than the country, names written inside covers: Elias, Thomas, Jonathan, Liberty, Ezekiel. Men who crossed oceans, burned forests, built machines, fought wars, stayed silent, spoken too late. Ethan listened. For the first time, history slowed down. He realized that his confusion was not new, that America had always been unfinished, that the Hale family had never been heroes or villains exclusively, but participants, that survival itself carried responsibility. Michael died quietly in 2023, his heart worn thin by stress and memory. Ethan stood at the funeral and felt the weight shift onto him, not as duty, but awareness. The Hale bloodline had reached a moment without maps. No frontier, no factory, no clear enemy, only choice. Ethan began to write. Not manifestos, not propaganda, stories, records, attempts to remember in a time designed to forget. He wrote about a boy on a ship, clutching iron while the ocean tried to erase him. He wrote about smoke-filled cities and silent fields and wars that promised endings and delivered cycles. He did not know what America would become, but he knew this: history was not something that happened to people. It was something people carried forward, whether they understood it or not. And the blood that crossed the ocean was still moving,
still asking what it meant to belong, still unfinished. Ethan Hale learned quickly that writing did not heal anything. It only exposed. He rented a small apartment in Richmond, Virginia, not far from where the James River curved slowly past the remnants of old industry and older lies. The city wore its history openly, statues pulled down, plaques argued over, streets named after men no one agreed how to judge anymore. Ethan felt at home there. By day, he worked contract jobs, data tagging, transcription, short-term research for companies that did not know his name and did not need to. By night, he wrote. He wrote longhand at first, the way his ancestors had, then transferred the words to a screen that glowed softly in the dark. He wrote about Elias Hale crossing an ocean because obedience felt safer than doubt. He wrote about Jonathan freezing at Valley Forge for an idea that would never fully keep its promise. He wrote about Thomas losing childhood to steel and Robert losing innocence to fire from the sky. He wrote about Michael, who fought wars without borders and came home to a country unsure why it sent him. Ethan did not write to condemn them. He wrote to understand. America, he realized, had always been a relay, each generation handing off unresolved questions to the next, wrapped in new language, new technology, new excuses. Freedom, security, prosperity, progress. The words changed tone, but never fully settled. In 2024, Ethan's writing began to circulate. Not widely, not virally, quietly. A historian at a small university reached out, then a journalist, then a nonprofit focused on civic education. They did not agree on everything Ethan wrote, but they agreed on one thing. It felt honest. Honesty was rare. Ethan was invited to speak at a high school, then a community college, then a veterans center. He stood in rooms filled with people who carried different versions of the same unease. Some were angry, some were tired, some were young and already braced for disappointment. He did not offer solutions, he offered context. He told them America had never been pure, never been finished, never been singular, that it had been built by believers and skeptics, by exploiters and builders, often by the same people in the same bodies, that pretending otherwise only guaranteed repetition. Some audiences applauded, some walked out. Ethan learned that telling the truth meant accepting rejection. Meanwhile, the country accelerated. Artificial intelligence reshaped labor, surveillance became frictionless, climate disasters arrived not as future warnings, but as recurring headlines. Wealth stratified further. The language of civil war re-entered casual conversation. Ethan watched it all with a strange calm. Fear, he knew, was not new. Collapse was not new. Neither was resilience. He began teaching a course online, unaccredited, informal, called American Memory. It had no grades, no ideology, only sources and stories. People joined from everywhere: veterans, immigrants, students, retirees, activists, skeptics. They argued fiercely, but they stayed. One evening, after a long session, Ethan walked along the river and thought about Elias again, the boy gripping iron as the ocean tried to erase him. That crossing had been an act of faith and fear combined. Every generation since had crossed something invisible but just as dangerous. Industrialization, total war, nuclear annihilation, digital abstraction. Now this. Ethan married late, not because he did not believe in love, but because he believed in responsibility. When he finally did, to a woman named Clara, a public librarian with a quiet voice and relentless curiosity, it felt deliberate rather than inevitable. They had a daughter in 2032. They named her Margaret, after the woman who crossed the Atlantic and learned to cook in a world that did not want her. Holding Margaret for the first time, Ethan felt something unfamiliar. Not hope, exactly, continuity. He wondered what kind of America his daughter would inherit, whether she would see the nation as a burden or a possibility, whether the stories he wrote would matter or be buried under faster, louder narratives. He resolved not to decide for her, only to leave evidence. Years passed. The Hale archive grew, letters digitized, journals preserved, oral histories recorded. What began as a personal project became a public one. Universities referenced it, teachers used it, critics attacked it, politicians ignored it. Ethan considered that a success. When asked what lesson the Hale family history offered, Ethan always answered the same way, that America was not a story about destiny. It was a story about choices, made under pressure, made imperfectly, made by people who rarely understood the consequences at the time. The ocean had not tested Elias Hale's faith. It had tested his willingness to step forward without guarantees. So had every century since. On his 60th birthday, Ethan stood by the river with Margaret, now a curious child asking hard questions too early. He asked why the country fought so much, why people lied, why history hurt. Ethan answered carefully. Because forgetting is easier than facing ourselves, and because facing ourselves is the only way anything gets better. Margaret skipped stones across the water. The river carried them away. The blood that crossed the ocean had not made America good or bad. It had made it human. And as long as someone was willing to remember, to look unflinchingly at what had been built and what had been broken, the story was not over. It never would be.
By the time Margaret Hale was 16, silence had become a luxury. The world spoke constantly, through screens embedded in walls, glasses, wrists, streets. Information did not arrive anymore, it surrounded. Algorithms predicted moods before people understood them. News personalized itself until no two citizens lived in the same country. Margaret had grown up inside this system, but did not fully trust it. Her father had taught her how to read footnotes before headlines, how to ask who benefited before asking who was right. Ethan never warned her about the future. He only trained her to question it. In 2048, the United States no longer argued about whether it was divided. It argued about whether it could remain whole. Climate migrations reshaped cities. Coastal towns retreated inland. Federal authority stretched thin as states demanded autonomy in the name of efficiency, safety, identity. Words history had taught the Hales to examine carefully. Margaret studied history and systems engineering. She believed memory and structure were not opposites, they were partners. Her senior project mapped generational decision-making, how small moral shortcuts repeated across centuries produced massive consequences. The Hale archive was her primary data set, not because it was heroic, but because it was ordinary. That was its power. When the Second Constitutional Convention was announced, first as a rumor, then as emergency, Margaret was 21. The country did not collapse, it negotiated. Economic instability, environmental displacement, and governance failures had forced the unthinkable back into discussion. The original Constitution, revered and strained, was no longer sufficient for a hyper-connected, unequal, technologically mediated society. Delegates were selected not only from states, but from professions, demographics, and civic institutions. For the first time, historians were formally included. Margaret was invited as an observer. She sat in a hall built of glass and recycled steel, listening to arguments that echoed debates centuries old: representation, power, rights, responsibility, security versus liberty, central authority versus local autonomy. Nothing was new, only the stakes.
One delegate argued that freedom required stronger surveillance to prevent chaos. Another argued that surveillance was the chaos. A third spoke of climate refugees as burdens. A fourth reminded the room that every American family was descended from refugees, whether they admitted it or not. Margaret did not speak often. When she did, she told a story. She spoke of a boy crossing an ocean because he feared a king and trusted God, of his descendants benefiting from systems they did not design and suffering from systems they refused to dismantle, of wars entered with certainty and exited with silence, of technology that promised clarity and delivered fragmentation. She did not assign blame, she described patterns. Some delegates dismissed her as sentimental, others listened carefully, a few took notes. Outside the hall, the public argued violently online. Inside, the arguments were quieter, but no less dangerous. Power always resented memory. Memory limited ambition. The final document did not fix everything. It never could. But it changed enough. It rebalanced representation, codified digital rights, limited corporate governance over public life, established mandatory historical impact assessments for major legislation. It was imperfect. It was human. When it passed, celebrations were cautious, no fireworks, no illusions of finality, just relief that negotiation had beaten collapse, this time. Margaret returned home to Richmond older than her years. Ethan was frail now, his voice softer but still precise. He read the new Constitution slowly, smiling not at what it promised, but at what it admitted: limits. He died the following winter, quietly, as his father had, and his father before him. Margaret buried him beside Clara, beneath a simple stone. She did not carve patriot or historian. She carved witness. Margaret continued the work. She expanded the archive beyond the Hale family, inviting others to contribute: families of immigrants, enslaved descendants, factory workers, soldiers, activists, skeptics. The project became decentralized, impossible to own, impossible to silence. It frustrated those who preferred simpler myths. That was the point. In 2076, the tricentennial of American independence, there were no grand parades. There were gatherings instead, local, uneven, honest. People read aloud names, stories, contradictions. They did not agree on what America was, but they agreed it was theirs to shape. Margaret stood with her own children, 2 of them, watching a river that had carried history long before the nation named it. She told them about Elias, about oceans, about silence and smoke and fire and glass. She told them that inheritance was not pride, it was responsibility. The blood that crossed the ocean was never special. What mattered was what each generation did with it. America was not redeemed. It was still becoming.
In the end, it was water that returned the story to its beginning. The Atlantic still moved the same way it had in 1637, indifferent, endless, patient. Ships were quieter now, cleaner, guided by satellites instead of stars. But the ocean had not changed its nature. It did not remember names. It did not honor intentions. It only tested passage. In 2094, Elijah Hale, named deliberately, the spelling softened by time, stood on the deck of a research vessel off the eastern seaboard and watched the horizon blur into light. He was 23, lean like Elias had been, carrying less fear but more knowledge. He knew the story, not as myth, as record. Elijah had grown up inside the Hale archive the way other children grew up inside churches or nations. He did not believe history was sacred. He believed it was instructional.
His grandmother, Margaret, had taught him that stories were not meant to comfort the future. They were meant to warn it. The vessel Elijah stood on monitored rising sea levels and underwater infrastructure, pipelines, cables, cities half forgotten beneath the waves. Climate had redrawn coastlines. Some towns existed only in memory and data. America had not fallen, it had adapted. That adaptation had been painful, uneven, contested, and incomplete, as it always was. Elijah specialized in historical risk modeling, using centuries of human behavior to anticipate failure points in modern systems. His work was unglamorous. It saved lives quietly. That, too, was a Hale trait. One evening, after the instruments had been checked and the crew settled into routine, Elijah opened a digital facsimile of the Hale Bible. The leather was gone, but the names remained: Elias, Thomas, Jonathan, Liberty, Ezekiel, Matthew, Thomas, Robert, James, Michael, Ethan, Margaret. No titles, no claims of righteousness, just survival marked in ink. Elijah thought about how often his ancestors had mistaken endurance for virtue, how often they had confused success with justice, how rarely they had been purely good or purely cruel. That complexity no longer frightened him. It steadied him. America, by the end of the 21st century, was no longer obsessed with dominance. It could not afford to be. Power had become too distributed, too visible, too fragile. The nation was respected not because it ruled, but because it revised itself without collapse. Not perfectly, but deliberately. Education centered on process rather than myth. Children learned how decisions compounded, how silence functioned as policy, how participation mattered even when it failed. The Hale archive was now part of that curriculum, not because the Hales were special, but because they were not. Elijah closed the file and looked back out at the ocean. He imagined Elias there, seasick and terrified, gripping iron because he had no language for uncertainty yet. He imagined the generations that followed, each crossing a different ocean: industrial, ideological, digital, environmental. Every crossing demanded a choice: advance blindly, retreat into fear, or move forward with eyes open. The vessel's horn sounded, a low, resonant note that carried across the water. Elijah felt no triumph, only continuity. He knew that one day someone would stand where he stood and judge his generation's choices as incomplete, flawed, insufficient. That was the contract of history, not to be absolved, but to be understood. The blood that crossed the ocean had never sought immortality. It sought ground. And ground, Elijah knew now, was not land. It was memory. As long as memory held, the crossing would continue, not as conquest, not as escape, but as responsibility. The ocean rolled on. So did the story.